This is part 2 on absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Now we're going to look at comparative advantage. Recall again that Adam Smith told us countries should produce goods in which they have an absolute advantage, but then based on the analysis we looked at last time, if this wasn't a 5 but was instead a 3, we would get these figures and we'd find that France can produce a third of a unit of beer in an hour and 1 unit of wine, and both of those are better than these numbers. Therefore, France would have an absolute advantage in the production of both of these goods, and as such would have no incentive to trade. So David Ricardo looked at all this, and this is some 50 years later, 1815, maybe 40 years later, and he said, well, if a country has absolute advantage in all goods, why would they engage in trade? Maybe it's not absolute advantage we should be looking at. Maybe it's comparative advantage, and that's this bottom grid. We'll flesh that out now. So for comparative advantage, we have to determine what the opportunity cost is for the production of each one of these goods. In other words, what's the relative price? Or I like to call it, what are you giving up when you make something? Okay? So if you make a unit of beer, and it takes you 3 hours to make a unit of beer, how much wine are you giving up? Well, if that's true, then you're going to give up 3 units of wine. Right? It takes you 3 hours to make a unit of beer. You could have made 3 units of wine in that time. Or, if you make a unit of wine, how much beer are you going to give up? Well, that would have been 1/3 of a unit of beer. Right? So they could have, if they have 1 hour and they made a unit of wine, well, they could have made 1/3 unit of beer in that same time. Now we can figure out these same numbers for Germany, and for Germany, for beer, it's 0.8, 0.8 units of wine, right? So they have 4 hours. If they make 1 unit of beer, that's 4 hours, so they can make 4/5 of a unit of wine, or 0.8 units of wine, and then the opposite's true. These are reciprocals moving up and down, so if they make a unit of wine, well, in the time, that's 5 hours. If they spent 5 hours making this, they could have made 1 1/4 units of beer. Okay? And then once you have that, you can then ask which country has a lower relative price or a lower opportunity cost, or is given up less. And from there you can clearly see, even when absolute advantage doesn't work out like it did here, France had an absolute advantage in both goods, according to Adam Smith's work. When we get to Ricardo's work, we see this is cheaper than this, therefore Germany has a comparative advantage in beer production, and this is cheaper than this, therefore France has a comparative advantage in wine production. And then from that, David Ricardo would have said, well, France should make wine and trade it with Germany, Germany should make beer and trade it with France. And even when these numbers don't work for an absolute advantage, countries will always have a comparative advantage.